Greetings, YouTubers. Welcome to part 3 in the Backcountry Water Treatment series. And part 1 was a discussion of boiling versus pasteurization, while part 2 takes a look at different methods of chemical disinfection. And if you haven't seen those, I do recommend watching them in order. Each video tends to build upon topics introduced previously. And for this discussion, I'd like to introduce the principle of core function. So what's the purpose of a water filter? It's nice if your filter works quickly and with minimal effort. It's even better if that filter is inexpensive and ultralight. But the purpose of backcountry water treatment isn't speed, cost, or weight. It is to make drinking water safe. That's what defines the core function of a filter: pathogen reduction. Now, I've seen comparisons that rate the best filter based solely on flow rates. And I don't dismiss the desirability of speed, but I suspect the omission of filtration percentages is based on a presumption that most reputable filters are essentially equivalent in that regard. In other words, they all basically filter enough, so just pick the fastest one. Well, that impression may be encouraged by marketing that suggests the false binary of you're either certified or you're not. Well, not all filters have the same removal percentages, and there's more to the issue than just the generic label description of meets or exceeds EPA standards. So let's get into it. But before we start talking about the filters themselves, it's necessary to lay some foundation for the question, how much safety is enough? Because the idea that you take unsafe water and run it through a filter to make it safe is another false binary. It would be more accurate to say that you take water that is of higher risk and filter it to produce water that is now of lower risk. So the question of water safety is really one of risk tolerance. What level of illness risk is acceptable to you? And note that there isn't a numerical or a scientific answer to that question. It's a personal choice that each and every one of us makes for ourselves. And I just want to point that out right at the beginning before I go on to terrorize you with a bunch of numbers. If you want the absolute smallest chance of swallowing even a single active germ, I suggest heat. Watch the part 1 video for details on how astonishingly high you can get your levels of pathogen reduction with even 1 minute of boiling. For others, that's well in excess of their own tolerance, and for others still, no effort at all is necessary. They're content to drink raw, untreated water and literally just risk it. In his book Trail Tested, Justin Lichter talks about his friend Eric D., who doesn't carry any water treatment and ends up with Giardia every time he hikes the PCT. Guess he doesn't mind waiting in town for a week or two until he feels better. Well, personally, I do mind. I've had food poisoning and I really didn't like it. So I'm willing to endure some amount of inconvenience in order to reduce my risk beyond just taking my chances. But there's a limit to how much trouble I'll go to. So I guess you could say I'm in the broad space between paranoid and blind. There's plenty of room in that middle for differing levels of risk tolerance. And lastly, as Mr. Lichter points out, nothing says that water treatment is an all or nothing proposition. You can choose to drink directly from a pristine source if you so desire and treat only water that appears to be sketchy. That's your call. Just remember, you can't actually see the microscopic things that will get you sick, which may be present in even the clearest looking water. And all that being said, this video is my attempt to help make that decision at least a little bit more of an informed choice. So what are the risks? Well, short answer, it's complicated. And why is it complicated? Well, it can vary a lot based on a number of variables, and factors include the time of year, temperature, weather, activity levels, and the type of land use in the area. It also depends on the type of microbiological hazard you're talking about. That's right, tubers. It's time to play Pick a Pathogen. And for our first contestant, Giardia lamblia, come on down. Giardia is the most common cause of parasitic gastrointestinal disease in the United States, with an estimated 20,000 cases occurring each year, and it exists in 2 forms. You swallow the cyst, which becomes activated by your stomach acid, and then the trophozoite then uses a sucker to attach to the lining of your small intestine and make you sick. It also produces more cysts, which you shed to the environment in your feces. It's not just people. Dogs are known for pooping Giardia all over the place, and some wild animals as well. The old-timers don't call it beaver fever for nothing. So, in an editorial on wilderness-acquired diarrhea for the Journal of Wilderness Medicine, yes, I have literally spent weeks researching diarrhea for this video, Anyway, the authors note that just 1 gram of beaver or human poop can contain 1,000,000 Giardia cysts. Which begs the question, how many does it take to get you sick? And that introduces an important concept: minimum effective dose. And I searched around, and according to another diarrhea article at the Journal of Wilderness Medicine, the minimum inoculum is 10 cysts. So we can start to sketch out the scope of the problem. An average-sized male produces about a pound of poop a day. For females, it's only 14 ounces. Ladies, if you've ever felt that guys are more full of it than you are, well, here's your proof. A pound is about 454 grams, and every gram contains 1,000,000 Giardia. And that means that if a good-sized hiker who's infected doesn't adequately bury their waste, and a rainstorm washes it into a drinking source, they could be unleashing upwards of 500 million with a B cysts into the old watering hole. So now you're starting to see why manufacturers talk about filtration rates like 99.999%. But those of you treating me with the skepticism I deserve could rightly point out that I haven't yet presented enough information for a risk assessment. If I were to fling poo into Lake Titicaca, it wouldn't matter what the total deposit was, unless I were to drink the whole lake. You see, it's always a matter of dose. First, you need to know the concentration in pathogens per liter, and then you need to consider how many liters you will be drinking. Concentration times consumption will give you the dose of pathogens consumed. So for example, if your water source has only 1 Giardia cyst per liter, you would have to drink 10 liters to get the minimum inoculum of 10 cysts to get you sick. If you're just passing by and you stop for a single liter of water and then move on, you're most likely to be okay. But if you were camped there for the weekend, you could easily end up drinking enough of that water to get infected. In order to perform some hypothetical risk assessments, we need to know some realistic field concentration levels. So it's back to researching diarrhea. This article from the Journal of Wilderness Medicine looked at cyst acquisition rates in the Desolation Wilderness area of Lake Tahoe. Water sampling from 3 popular stream sites revealed cyst contamination to be generally at low levels, with cyst concentration in the single-digit range for every 100 gallons filtered, meaning you have to drink more than 100 gallons of that water to get the minimum dose. Still, the authors note that Giardia cyst acquisition in backcountry travelers was 5.7%. That's better than 1 in 20 chance. Everybody gets to decide for themselves whether they're happy with those odds or not. Now, going back to the editorial on wilderness-acquired diarrhea, remember how beaver stools can contain 1,000,000 Giardia cysts per gram? Well, the authors note, stream contamination from a beaver has been calculated to reach 245 cysts per gallon. In this instance, small amounts of water may cause infection, similar to an outbreak among lap swimmers from inadvertent water ingestion in a fecally contaminated pool. At 245 cysts per gallon, you're talking about more than 64 per liter. If, without realizing it, you stop to drink from a beaver stream like this one, you could get your minimum dose of Giardia in just this much water. A few more concepts in epidemiology before we finally start talking about filters. From an article on giardiasis at Medscape, the rate of symptomatic infection in the natural setting varies from 5 to 70%. So with Giardia, just because you're infected doesn't mean you're ill. You may not have any symptoms. And for those that do catch the disease, the incubation period averages 1 to 2 weeks with a mean of 9 days. So there can be a tendency to think that if you get sick, it was the last thing you ate or drank. But in the case of Giardia, it was actually something you consumed over a week ago. Also, minimum infective dose is actually more complicated than I've made it sound. You'll see things like a D50 number or even a D1. You see, not every strain or every sample of a disease is the same, just as not everyone's susceptibility is the same. So a D50 is the dose at which 50% of the population will get sick. There's no one number for everybody. A D1 is the dose at which only 1% gets sick. So again, from the article on giardiasis, the infective dose is low in humans. 10 to 25 cysts are capable of causing clinical disease in 8 of 25 subjects. Ingestion of more than 25 cysts results in a 100% infection rate. So basically, below 10 cysts, you shouldn't get sick. Over 25, and you will. And between those limits, you have a varying chance. So if we assume that what you're concerned about is actual illness and not merely asymptomatic infection, these 2 factors are what I call mitigating circumstances to your risk. Not everyone who drinks a marginal dose will get infected, and not everyone who gets infected will get sick. On the other side, an aggravating circumstance to your risks comes from the distinction between a statistical dose and an actual dose. Just because a test sample from a water source results in a concentration of, say, 2 cysts per liter, it doesn't mean you're perfectly safe if you only drink 1 liter. The distribution of cysts floating in a body of water is never perfectly random. If you were to draw water from right here, you could get very different results than if you happened to collect that same liter from here. In other words, 2 cysts per liter is a statistical figment. It's just an average. An actual sample drawn from such a concentration could, in reality, contain anything from 0 cysts to enough to make you sick. So for perspective on how this actually affects your chances, we go back to the study on prevention and treatment of wilderness-acquired diarrhea. As noted previously, the study found that Giardia concentrations were usually low. The authors calculated the probability of getting that minimum infective dose of 10 from a contamination of just 40 cysts per 100 gallons. They extrapolate that to a concentration of 1.2 cysts per gallon, and they get there because the filtration method used in the study was known to only capture about 30% of the Giardia present. So in terms of importance to the backcountry traveler, this would translate into a cyst concentration of 0.3 cysts per quart, or a 1 in 33 chance of acquiring a minimum inoculum from a canteen full of water. So even if the statistical dose from a volume of water with a particular concentration is way below the minimum required for infection, your actual drink could still realistically contain enough pathogens to get you in trouble. So as I said, there are both mitigating and aggravating circumstances to the risks involved. And then lastly, no risk assessment should be without consideration of the stakes. It's not just a question of if you get sick, but also one of what happens when you do. Now, from the Medscape article, the prognosis for patients with giardiasis is generally excellent. Most patients are asymptomatic, and most infections are self-limited, meaning it eventually takes care of itself. And giardiasis is not associated with mortality except in rare cases of extreme dehydration, primarily in infants and malnourished children. Well, that's all good news so far. Also, several antibiotic agents are available with good efficacy rates to shorten the disease course, although drug resistance has been observed in the clinical experience. Doesn't sound that bad so far, but bear in mind the uniqueness of your circumstances in the backcountry. From the editorial on wilderness-acquired diarrhea, the authors point out, diarrheal illness is more easily managed by a traveler staying in a hotel with a toilet and having access to motorized transportation than by the wilderness traveler living in a tent and needing to travel under his or her own power. The potential for dehydration from gastroenteric fluid losses adds to the risk of any wilderness activity. Because of that, the authors certainly would include packets of oral rehydration salts for long trips. And for a discussion of ORS packets versus regular electrolyte supplements, see Part 4 of the Nutrition series. Well, maybe you're like Mr. Lichter's friend who just risks it and gets sick every time. Now, here is some of what you might face. Untreated giardiasis can last for weeks. Weight loss, disaccharidase deficiency, malabsorption, and growth retardation are possible complications. Some patients may experience persistent symptoms like chronic diarrhea, malabsorption, despite apparently effective antibiotic treatment, although these usually subside over weeks to months. However, Hanovic et al. Found symptoms consistent with irritable bowel syndrome and/or functional dyspepsia in 76 of 82 patients at least 6 months after eradication of Giardia infection. Patients reported bloating, diarrhea, and abdominal pain, which were exacerbated by specific foods or by physical or mental stress. Imagine not being able to eat tacos or pizza for months. Well, finally, another study by Hanovic and colleagues associated giardiasis with the presence of IBS and chronic fatigue even 6 years after infection. So like I said, risk assessment includes consideration of the stakes. You might spend a little effort to avoid a minor inconvenience. You might go to greater lengths to avoid something that is potentially significantly more troublesome. And the authors of the journal editorial conclude, despite the effectiveness of antibiotics to treat most cases of TD, preventive measures are still highly recommended. So they say, add an antibiotic to your wilderness med kit and don't forget an anti-diarrheal and those oral rehydration salts. However, I must argue strongly that preventative measures should be employed by the wilderness traveler. So with preventative measures brings us finally to talk of the filters themselves. In the US, the standard for microbiological water purifiers is set by the EPA. So in order to call your product a purifier, it must eliminate at least 6 log of bacteria and 4 log of viruses and 3 log of protozoa. The log removal rates are discussed in more detail in parts 1 and 2 of this water treatment series, but as a reminder, a 1 log reduction means you take out 90% of the germs in question. So if you had 100 pathogens in your water bag, a 1 log filter would remove 90 of them, leaving you with 10 pathogens to drink. 2 log reduction is removal of 99%. And it goes right on past the decimal, meaning 3 log removal is 99.9%, 4 log is 99.99%, etc. So as far as the difference between a purifier and a microfilter, MSR has a blog post that sums it up succinctly. While a purifier must remove all 3 pathogen types, a microfilter only needs to handle protozoa and bacteria. This video is specifically about microfilters, and I'll have to push viruses and purifiers into the next episode. So for our purposes here, the standard for a microfilter is 6 log removal of bacteria and 3 log removal of protozoa. And that means if your filter captures 99.9% of the Giardia in your water pouch, it can proudly display that meets EPA standards for protozoa logo on the box. And all that foundation of Giardia concentrations and dose that I dragged you through, well, your patience is about to pay off. Let's go on a theoretical hike with our hiker microfilter and see how the log removal math actually plays out in real-world scenarios. So going back to the example of a canteen full of water with an average concentration of 0.3 cysts per quart or liter, that gives us a 1 in 33 chance of getting an unlucky cluster of 10 cysts in our particular scoop of that water, just enough to get you sick. Well, personally, I'd like better odds than that. And consider that an average through hike of the PCT takes 152 days. And suppose you filter just 4 liters a day from various sources. That's 608 field samples of water that you will drink over the course of the hike. And certainly all those samples won't necessarily contain Giardia. Say 5.5% of them do. Out of 608 rolls of the dice, 5.5% will get you 33 hits. And guess what 33 tickets to a 1 in 33 lottery makes you? A likely winner. Now that's all completely hypothetical, but it puts into perspective the logic behind why Mr. Lichter's friend gets sick every time he hikes the PCT. He's rolling low-scoring dice, but he's doing it so many times that inevitably his number always comes up. But that's from drinking unfiltered water. You carry one of these to improve your odds. So let's apply some log reduction and see what happens. And going back to our canteen scenario, we had an average concentration of 0.3 cysts per liter, giving you a 1 in 33 chance of getting too much Giardia in your sample. So if you drink like that again and again over the course of a through hike, odds are you will get sick. So you bring along a Catadine hiker microfilter to sift the water as you go, thereby removing an EPA-approved 99.9% of those protozoa floating invisibly in your canteen. That 3 log removal pushes the decimal point 3 spaces downhill, resulting in a filtered average concentration of just 0.0003 cysts per liter. If we likewise push the decimal on your chances of getting sick, your odds are now in the range of 1 in 33,000. At that rate, you could roll those dice 4 times for every one of your days on the PCT and probably not get sick. Though your chances would be about 1 in 54, which might be reassuring to some and still worrisome to others. So would you be more comfortable if the odds were more like 1 in 500? Then that 99.9% standard isn't going to be enough. You'll need something with at least a 4 log removal rate. As mentioned, the Catadine hiker only claims to offer the basic 3 log removal. The same is true for the MSR Autoflow and the Grail GeoPress. All of these advertise only the EPA minimum. The performance data sheet for the Aquamira Greenline filter shows 99.95%, and that's 3.5 logs. Adventure Medical's Rapid Pure filter offers 99.9975% removal for Giardia, or 4 3/4 logs. And then LifeStraw promises a full 5 logs of protozoan protection in both their original straw format and their newer gravity system, the Flex. For the Catadine Be-Free, the box reports the minimum 3 log removal required by the EPA. Now for all these filters, by the way, I did my best to find actual test results, not just the ad copy from packages or a website. Fortunately, most manufacturers don't seem to provide links to qualified laboratory results, even on their technology or science pages. And Catadine was like that. I looked everywhere on their site and I couldn't find any lab results. So I resorted to open web searches, and after quite a bit of sleuthing, came across this 64-page PDF. It's essentially a packet of their product pamphlets, but way down on page 40, you finally get to a study from BioVir Laboratories. In it, a cover letter describes how the bee-free hollow fiber filter was tested to a modified US EPA standard. And on page 42, the results. Microspheres, which are an approved proxy for Giardia, were reduced from the 6th power to less than 100. And this exceeds the goal for cyst reduction with a demonstrated greater than 5 log reduction of microspheres, also known as a 99.999% reduction. And why Catadine doesn't put that on their box, I can't imagine. As far as provenance goes, I did not find this report within Catadine's internet domain. It's hosted here. It's a website for the Catalyze company, which I had to have Google translate from Hebrew. They have apparently represented Catadine in Israel since 1988. Anyway, let's take a look at whether or not you might find 5 logs of cyst reduction desirable on trail. The canteen scenario I've been using involved a relatively low concentration of Giardia, and 3 log reduction from there probably puts the risk into the acceptable category for at least some people. But consider that on a long hike, your chances go up of encountering water sources that can be, shall we say, more challenging. Remember the beaver stream water? Stream contamination from a beaver has been calculated to reach 245 cysts per gallon, and that's about 65 cysts per liter. With a 3 log reduction, that takes it down to about 0.06 cysts per liter, which is around a fifth of what was in the canteen scenario. There, your odds of getting sick were 1 in 33. So just playing fast and loose with the probabilities, if a fifth the concentration gives you a fifth the risk, you're looking at chances after 3 log filtration that are in a range of a few hundred to 1. Over the course of an entire through hike, where you may source water from the field several hundred times, odds like that could still get you sick. But 5 log reduction is 2 orders of magnitude higher than 3 log, and that's 100 times more. So protection at that level should allow you to drink filtered beaver water repeatedly while keeping your chances of getting sick beyond 1 in 1,000. However, beaver water isn't the worst it gets. Cow water is. And recalling from part 1, Average Hiker had a blog post on how sketchy some of the water sources can be on the Continental Divide Trail. Now, hikers share this muddy puddle with the cattle that drink from and defecate in that water. Well, this original research, published in Wilderness and Environmental Medicine, was a 5-year study of the risk factors for coliform bacteria in the backcountry lakes and streams of the Sierra Nevadas. And while we're not quite to bacteria yet, but coliforms are known indicators of fecal contamination. E. coli and Giardia are both spread by feces. In the study, the authors note that concentrations up to 14,000 Giardia cysts per liter of water have been found in storm surface water below California dairies. Beaver water was only 65 cysts per liter, and it took 5 logs of reduction to get a reasonable margin of safety for a through hike. Well, cow water is over 215 times as dangerous, and that's 2 orders of magnitude higher still. So, where can you find 7 log cyst removal in a portable backcountry filter? Well, so far, I've only been able to find one place. Like the Catadine Bee Free, the Sawyer Mini is another one whose advertising isn't at the level of their test results for some reason. And currently, their webpage only claims 6 log cyst removal. But in any event, they do have a lab report with tests performed to US EPA standards. In this case, they used Micrococcus luteus as an approved surrogate for Giardia cysts. And the filtrate was collected after 100, 500, and 900 milliliters of water passage. And this was done for each of 3 filters tested for a total of 9 results, shown here in Table 4. So as you can see, log removal values exceeded 7 for every sample. And that's 4 logs greater than the standard required to meet certification. Well, think about that in comparison. In a scenario where the Sawyer Mini leaves behind a single Giardia cyst, any filter that purportedly achieves the minimum 3 logs would, statistically speaking, fail to capture 10,000 cysts. You may not need those extra 4 logs of reduction all the time, but wait until you need to drink from Bessie's bathtub, where there are 1.4 times 10 to the 4th cysts per liter. And just a reminder, I am not endorsed by anybody. I don't get anything for free or discount. I don't have affiliate links or get any kind of benefit from the sale of any product at all. And all of my research is independent, so any conclusions or mistakes that follow are strictly my own. Okay, so what I hope that did was establish at least some perspective on the levels of risk involved in backcountry water treatment. And I tried to do that using some real-world pathogen concentrations against rates of filtration offered in products available today. As I said earlier, the odds you're okay with, your risk tolerance, is a personal choice. Whether you're a 1 in 100 person or you're not comfortable until the chances fall below 1 in 1,000 or better is totally up to you. And I'm not trying to freak anybody out, just give you a rational basis from which to judge those odds for yourself. And when you're wandering around somewhere between 0 and 99.999999%, that's a pretty big room, and the range can seem inconceivably massive. So I find it helps to have something that provides a little scale. Okay, so with that framework established, we can hopefully proceed through the rest of the pathogens to be discussed more quickly. And there's one other protozoan of significance to mention. It's our old friend from parts 1 and 2, Cryptosporidium parvum. From a study published in Environmental Health Review, which was conducted in Canada, the authors note that the highest concentration of crypto so far documented in surface water source was 30,000 oocysts per 100 liters, or 300 per liter. So comparing that to beaver water, that was 65 Giardia cysts per liter, and it took 5 logs of reduction to get good odds over a very long hike. Well, this crypto concentration isn't 10 times that, so an extra log of removal should get us at least as comfortable as before. But remember that the minimum infective dose of Giardia is 10 cysts. Well, now check out this little tidbit. Illness, nevertheless, could still occur simply because one oocyst is all that is needed to produce a coccidial infection. Therefore, without a total inactivation of oocysts, chemicals and treatment devices that were reportedly making several log reductions will not keep campers and hikers from dangers. So at 1/10 the dangerous dose, we're back to needing all the log removal available in order to keep the odds down of getting sick. And mind you, that's when we're talking about worst case water. The other main concern in backcountry water comes from potentially pathogenic bacteria. And these can include Listeria, Shigella, Campylobacter, and Salmonella. But based on the literature, the one they talk about most is E. coli. For bacteria, most of the concepts will be the same as they were with the discussion on protozoa, but there are a few different ones. The first thing to appreciate is the difference between total coliforms and actual disease-causing pathogens. Total coliforms are a large group of bacteria that exist throughout the environment. And they're in the soil, they're on plants, and they're present in surface waters. And generally, they're not harmful to humans. But there are subsets of coliforms that can be. And that subset lives in the guts and waste of humans and animals, are called fecal coliforms. And when these are present, it indicates the water has been contaminated by feces. Well, not all fecal coliforms are harmful either. It's a subset of these that include the infamous E. coli. And further still, only some types of E. coli are harmful, like the strain 0157H7. So you'd think that scientific studies of water safety would report concentrations of dangerous E. coli strains directly. But they don't. Many report total coliforms. It's an issue of pragmatics. There's far too many types for it to be practical to test for them all. And even amongst the strains of E. coli specifically, it would take expensive and time-consuming genetic typing to sort them out. So total coliform is used as a proxy for when contamination by feces may be present. They're what's known as classic indicators of contamination. In a study published in the Journal of Water Research, the authors state, "Our research has demonstrated that classic indicators can be considered as efficient detectors of pathogens in most cases." Another thing to know about coliform reporting is that the numbers are given as CFUs, or colony-forming units. You see, they don't just slap a sample under a microscope and count individual bacterium cells. Rather, the sample is put into a petri dish with a growth medium, and those invisible individual cells are colonized into the more easily counted CFUs. And there are, of course, pros and cons to this. One advantage is that this method only counts live bacteria. Dead ones might show up on a microscope slide, but they don't really matter as a health risk. The disadvantage is that CFUs almost certainly underestimate the actual number of viable bacterial cells in any given sample, perhaps significantly. And that's because each CFU is counted with the assumption that it was formed by a single cell. However, solitary cells are the exception in nature, and bacteria tend to form chains or grow in clumps. So a single CFU may likely have been formed by a number of separate living cells. But with all that in mind, let's tackle the issue of infective dose. So according to the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, the effective dose for the 0157H7 strain of E. coli is 5 to 10 cells. Well, remember the 1 million cysts per gram of beaver poop? Well, dog droppings are considered one of the leading causes of E. coli pollution. Each gram of dog poo has over 20 million E. coli colonies in it. So if you do get sick from E. coli, the disease you'll get is called hemorrhagic colitis, with children and the elderly as the most susceptible. A possible complication is development of the potentially fatal hemolytic uremic syndrome. And this occurs when small blood vessels in the kidney become inflamed and get damaged. Blood clots can form that clog the filtering system and lead to kidney failure. And for children aged 6 to 14, the D1 for HUS from E. coli is 41.9 bacterial cells. In other words, exposure to about 42 E. coli cells will give 1% of young teens the syndrome. For kids under 6, the D1 is only about 8 cells. Okay, that gives us a basis for some upcoming risk calculations, but with at least one key piece of the puzzle still missing. And those 5 to 10 cells for an infective dose is from O157H7 specifically. But even when studies do identify E. coli concentrations out of total coliforms, they typically still don't type the strain to anyone in particular. So we need a clue as to what fraction of all E. coli present in a sample might be pathogenic to humans. And for that, the best I could find came from this study of the risk factors for coliform bacteria. The authors sampled water from 364 locations along the Sierra Nevada mountains for a 5-year analysis. And they categorized the sampling sites by their use type with the following results. 9% of wild sites contained coliforms, as did 12% of day hike site samples, 18% of backpacker sites, 63% of locations where pack animals are in use, and a whopping 96% of cattle areas. Cattle are also noted to carry E. coli strain O157H7 at a rate of 1% to 30%. Placing persons who drink untreated water below established cow pastures at risk for very serious disease. In order to perform some filtration math on bacterial threats, I'm going to proceed with the following assumptions, which I want to be upfront about so you can judge for yourself the value of any conclusions reached. You carry the filter specifically for the worst case scenarios. Worst case scenarios for contamination involve cattle, and cattle contain the harmful strain of E. coli at a rate of 10%. I picked the 10% from the range of 1 to 30 because it's conservatively below average and it's a nice round number. So for the sake of having a number to work with in some log removal calculations, I'm interpreting that to mean that for peak E. coli concentrations, which are usually from pastures where grazing occurs, only 10% of that amount is to be counted as potentially pathogenic. So with that in mind, what kind of field concentrations are we talking about? This paper from Wilderness and Environmental Medicine sampled 31 sites in the Sierra Nevada National Forest. Coliforms identified as E. coli were found in nearly half the sites studied. 8 of those had high levels of coliforms, all of which correlated with heavy human use or commercial grazing. And this table shows the concentrations detected. Note that the units for coliform bacteria are in CFUs per 100 milliliters. So we have to add a 0 onto all these numbers to get the amount per liter. But since I'm guesstimating that only 10% of E. coli is pathogenic to humans, we can just lop that 0 right back off and deal with the numbers as shown as though they were per liter. So that means if you were to draw a canteen of cool, clear mountain water from Phipps Creek, you could end up swallowing 100 dangerous E. coli bacteria when the infectious dose is only 5 to 10. Now, I don't know what the spacing on these sites is like, but if you were hiking through the area and you had to drink randomly from half the locations here, the odds are almost a given that you'll get sick. So using the lower limit of 5 bacterial cells as the minimum, a liter of water from Buckeye Creek would give you over 100 times the infectious dose. And since without testing there's no way of knowing from one year to the next where the contamination may be, this leads me to conclude once again that routine filtration is a good idea. Another study sampled a total of 55 locations from 3 different areas. Coliform bacteria were detected in 22 of the 55 sites, all of which were below areas used by backpackers or pack animals. And as with the previous study, the coliforms were identified as E. coli and reported in CFUs per 100 milliliters. So here are the results for Kings Canyon National Park, and plus a table for the concentrations found in Yosemite. And the numbers for Sequoia National Park. Interestingly, The highest concentration found anywhere in the study came from a water faucet at a campground in Bear Paw Meadow. Apparently, you can't automatically trust that spigot near the ranger station. It might actually be worse than anything you'd find in the wild. So doing a little more skeptical math on that worst case water, the EPA sets the standard for bacterial reduction at 6 logs. And that's just a reduction standard, mind you. It's not an end presence standard. Also, there's a difference between swimming water and drinking water. In New York and Vermont, for instance, the health protection level of E. coli in recreational waters is 235 CFUs per 100 milliliters. That's 2,350 per liter. They'd actually let you swim in that water from the campground faucet in Sequoia. And that's because the presumption is that what minimal water gets in your mouth and swallowed while swimming is de minimis. Remember, it's the dose that matters, and that's based on both concentration per liter and the number of liters consumed. But, for the record, the presence of any fecal coliform in drinking water is cause for concern and requires immediate action. In other words, the official goal for E. coli count in drinking water is none. So what the reduction standard is meant to do, presumably, is remove enough bacteria from your water to get you as close as possible to a statistical concentration of 0. If we apply the EPA's 6 log removal to 2,000 bacteria per liter, we get an average concentration of 0.002 cells per liter. And assuming the distribution odds work similarly to cysts, that's something like a 1 in 2,500 chance of getting the minimum inoculum of 5 in your canteen. Admittedly, that doesn't sound horrible, but it's also not what I would call luxuriously safe. Permit me to be pessimistic for a moment. 1 in 2,500 was for a single liter of water, but at a campground with a faucet, I'd probably be filling up my 3-liter reservoir. So drink all of that, and now I'm at 1 in 833. Okay, but remember how colony-forming units undercount the true number of individual cells? Bacteria in the wild tend to cluster. And I'm just speculating now. It might be a few, it might be dozens. For round numbers, say each CFU actually represents a cluster of 10 cells instead of a single one. Well, pass that decimal to the left-hand side, and all of a sudden, we're back in the ballpark of 1 in 100 for the odds of getting sick from a bladder fillip at a bad spot, even after filtration. And then consider what your odds might be if you end up rolling dice like that more than once on a long hike. So as before, a model of risk assessment includes not just the odds of getting infected, but also the consequences of becoming ill. Hemorrhagic colitis is more serious than giardiasis. What that does is make me want to push the odds even further down to maintain homeostasis with my personal tolerance for overall risk. So to translate that back to filtration rates, if you are satisfied with 1 in 1,000 odds, look for filters with 7 log reduction. If you prefer the odds of getting a potentially fatal disease to be more like 1 in 10,000, get 8 logs if you can. As it happens, 8 logs are available. LifeStraw claims 8 log removal of bacteria on their site and their packaging, as well as 5 log for cysts. And those lab results for the Catadine B free also show 8 log bacterial removal and 5 log for cysts. The Sawyer Minis lab results showed 8 log removal of bacteria and 7 log for cysts. And that's the combined highest set of filtration rates that I've been able to find. The Grail Geopress, the Catadine Hiker, the Aquamira Green Line, the MSR Autoflow, and the Adventure Medical Rapid Pure all advertise the EPA minimum of 6 logs. And I should note that the Grail and the Rapid Pure are the only filters here to also claim virus reduction, and that's a topic I'll have to push into part 4 of this series, a video whose explicit purpose will be on how not to go viral. Okay, that covers the removal rate, which is, to me, the core function of a water filter. Next is a quicker discussion of what you might call a key feature, service life. How many gallons of water can your filter process before it's done? I'm working on a test protocol where I might be able to see how flow rate drops off with use, but that would be a future video. For now, I'm just comparing manufacturers' claims of service life. So, in ascending order, the Grail Geopress has a cartridge lifespan of 350 cycles at 24 ounces of water per cycle, and that's 8,400 ounces, which checks out roughly with their reported 65 gallons. The Aquamira Green Line can push through 100 gallons, while Adventure Medical's Rapid Pure filters for 200 gallons. And note that there's a purifier lifespan of 25 gallons, but that's for viruses, and more on that in a future video. The Catadiene B freeze fact sheet says up to 1,000 liters, whereas the MSR Autoflow lists a cartridge life of 1,500 liters. The Life Straw Flex lasts up to 500 gallons, and the Classic Life Straw says it's good for 4,000 liters. And then along comes Sawyer claiming 100,000 gallons! It's the sort of jump that invites a closer look. How is that even remotely possible? Well, no filter of any kind will resist clogging indefinitely. By their very nature, they will all fill up. Therefore, in order to keep using it, a filter will have to be cleaned. And it's the effectiveness of this cleaning that will ultimately control the service life of your filter. So when you see a number like 100,000 gallons, what you're probably looking at is a filter that provides you with superior opportunities for cleaning. And as it turns out, that's exactly what Sawyer claims. According to a fact sheet, thicker walls and a smaller inner diameter make their fibers 75% stronger. And the value of that strength in this context is that it allegedly allows the filter to be backflushed more forcefully and repeatedly than the competition. And Sawyer claims that you can restore up to 98% of the flow rate this way. Sounds good, but the skeptic's motto is, show me. So here's a lab test done by the Clean Water Institute of Calvin College. And basically they ordered copies of several filter brands and dissected them and examined the fibers under a microscope for measurement. Table 1 shows the results for wall thickness, with the 3 Sawyer models being the highest. Table 2 shows measurements for inner diameter, with the 3 Sawyers being the smallest. And Table 3 shows engineering calculations for hypothetical hoop stress, with the Sawyer trio experiencing the least. The Catadiene B free, for instance, shows almost 130% higher stress under pressure than any of the Sawyers. Okay, so theoretically you can backflush it harder, but 100,000 gallons? Messiah College did a study for Sawyer where they rigged up 24 filters in an apparatus to pump water through them, including the ability to regularly and forcefully backflush. And over a year of testing, 62,000 gallons of water were put through each filter. And then each filter was tested for integrity. And after 230,000 liters of flow per filter, which represents 30 years of typical household use for a bucket filter, all 24 filters exceeded the EPA standard of 6-log removal of bacteria. In fact, only one of the 24 filters had any bacteria breakthrough. That was the one with 6-log results, while all the other filters had 0 bacteria breakthrough, indicating the 8-log reduction levels found in other studies. The authors note that the testing involved pressures 10 times higher than what would be found under typical use. So these tests were done with a Sawyer 0.1 filter, which I believe is just the old name for a squeeze. In any event, they look identical. So with forceful and regular backflushing, you can get a lot of water through a Sawyer. But it's not entirely without consequence, and the cost comes in reduced flow rate over time. So even if you're able to restore 98% flow each time you backflush, that's still a cumulative degradation, and after the second backflush, you'd be at 98% of 98%, which is 96%, and so on and so on. So over time, the graph of your flow rate will look like this, which is from the same study. They had also tested a couple of Sawyer minis to prove it was similar. So admittedly, I'd rather not see the flow rate drop below 0.5. In order to filter a liter of water at that rate, it would take you over 2 minutes. Though, is 2 minutes really so unbearable? Sure, I'd prefer faster, but look at it in comparison to your other options for treatment. You can't disinfect a liter of water with either heat or chemicals anywhere near that fast. And so even after it's become a dog, that filter is still your fastest method. Also, take a look at the horizontal scale of this graph. Each line represents 1,000 minutes of flow time. For that entire first kilominute, it looks like you're averaging about 1.75 liters per minute. And that means by the time you hit this line, you've filtered about 1,750 liters of water. Well, according to Catadiene's own spec of up to 1,000 liters depending on water quality, a B-free would already be trash by now. Well, let's be skeptical for a minute. The year of water used in the Sawyer flow study included 30 days straight of challenge water, defined by the World Health Organization as containing high solids, turbidity, hardness, and salts. But the rest of it was tap water. And while not all your field sources will be as bad as challenge water, it may also never be as clean as tap. So the applicability of their 230,000 liter results to actual wilderness use remains an open question. Also, they were backflushing at 10 psi, which was admittedly 10 times the pressure used in a typical bucket setup. And later, the pressure regulators were removed, which allowed backflush to be up to 18 psi. Well, if you're not backflushing that hard on trail, you're not clearing your filter out as well either. And that would lead me to expect less service life and even greater flow decrease than reported. And I suspect that's what's going on when you see reviews complaining about the Sawyer flow rate. Remember the smaller inner diameter that leads to greater fiber strength? Well, smaller holes might have something to do with a smaller initial flow rate. And the trade-off was for a greater ability to maintain that rate through backflushing. But that's only a bonus if you take proper advantage of it, meaning you've got to backflush as strenuously as you can manage in order to even approach the service life claimed. I think that's the problem. In all the reviews I've seen, nobody carries this. Most people seem to opt for the bottle backflush method, but that isn't going to produce the kind of pressure you can by really leaning on this plunger. So Sawyer's instructions explicitly state that inadequate pressure can lead to the backflush just tunneling some channels through the debris rather than blowing it all out. What all this means is your mileage may vary. I'd like to develop a test protocol wherein I could put different filters through the same regimen and report on the comparison, but until I can do that, these reports are the best I can share. And whatever the flaws in such tests, Sawyer seems to be the only one making their results public. I couldn't find anything comparable from any of the other sites I investigated. Now, in light of the concept that the forcefulness and regularity of backflushing is directly responsible for the lifespan of your filter, some of Catadyne's marketing is sort of interesting. Easily clean the Easy Clean membrane by simply shaking or swishing. No backflushing or tools necessary. However, backflushing isn't the flaw, it's a feature, is the only way you'll be able to keep your filter functioning over long periods of time and through high volumes of water. In fairness, backflushing is a chore, but that doesn't mean it's not still a benefit. If you prefer not to go through the trouble, that's fine, but what's suggested as some sort of an advantage is essentially just an argument in favor of disposability. Even if Sawyer has overestimated longevity by nearly a factor of 4, such that the Mini's lifespan is really 100,000 liters instead of gallons, at only 1,000 liters each, you'd still have to buy 100 of these to filter as much as this. And then depending on your circumstances, lower maintenance and higher replacement may suit you better. The B-Freeze filtration rates were top tier, second only to the Sawyer, so it's good to have options for every type of usage environment. Now I got one because I'm going to try it out as my day hike filter, but for longer trips, I'll still be carrying one of these. Okay, in summation, ease of use and versatility do matter, but they are not the core function of a backcountry water filter. Pathogen removal is, and it's a false binary to suggest that a given filter is either safe or not. Safety comes in degrees, and it's reflected in the probability of getting sick from contaminated water. A given filter doesn't just meet standards or not. It will offer varying levels of protection based on the filtration percentages, also known as log removal rates. As such, some filters are more safe than others. And how much safety do you really need? Well, based on some crude and at times speculative math using real-world concentrations of pathogens and lab-tested levels of available filtration, it appears that at least for the most challenging waters, more is better, especially for longer trips. So if you anticipate significant need, look for filters with the highest log removal rates. Filters can differ by powers of 10 over their service life as well, and this will affect cost of replacement and has the potential to impact reliability when you're deep in the backcountry. I'm hoping the discussion can help serve as part of your toolbox for evaluating other filters not mentioned here. And there's a ton of brands out there, and they will keep appearing over time. So, when you see the interwebs light up with talk of the latest new filter, put it through a quick comparison based on core function and key feature, just for perspective on where it fits in. Platypus came out with a new microfilter called the Quick Draw, so let's check it out. They've got the generic meets all guidelines removal rates of 6 log for bacteria and 3 log for protozoa, and the cartridge life is 1,000 liters. And this is where those numbers fit in. To me, those are the two most important criteria. If a filter doesn't meet your standards for either one, it doesn't really matter how fast it flows or how many different ways you can hook it up. If all filters offered the same level of protection and had the same lifespan, a discussion solely of flow rates might be more appropriate. But at least among filters using similar technologies, there are certain physical realities that you presently can't get around. Fluid mechanics demands certain trade-offs. If you've got two filters that use the same type of hollow fibers and one filter flows faster than the other, ask yourself, what's the give and take? Take the Sawyer Mini and the Squeeze, for example. Same manufacturer, same fibers, same filtration. But the Squeeze has a significantly higher flow rate. And just look at it. The way to get faster filtration from the same fibers is to use more of them. The trade-off is increased size, weight, and cost. Incidentally, I follow a lot of thru hikers who are pretty hardcore about shaving weight, and many of them have gone back to the Squeeze just because they find the added speed worth it from having to use the thing so often on trail. Another way to increase flow rate, despite having similar technology, is to just use fibers with bigger holes. And obviously a bigger hole will pass more water, but it also costs you in filter effectiveness, as the size of the holes directly relates to the ability to remove pathogens. So when you see two hollow fiber filters that are almost identical in size and shape, but one is reputed to flow more quickly than the other, ask yourself at what cost, because another way to pay for that speed is with less effective removal. Okay, that's enough of me editorializing. I realize there's more to say about filters, and I think I need at least 2 more videos in the series, one on virus protection, also known as purifiers, and I'd like to do something on usability. And this could include everything from flow rate testing and backflushing methods to versatility of use. I've also begun thinking quite a bit about the options for pre-filtration when the water's really bad. And that could be useful not just to save the life of your filter, but it also has advantages whether you're pasteurizing or treating with chemicals. Which reminds me, there's been a sort of elephant in the room, and that's the notion of a combined strategy for water treatment. Filters are the fastest and easiest way to produce field water in bulk. You don't have to consume any chemicals or burn any fuel. But the currently available log protection isn't nearly as luxurious as what you can achieve by over-pickling your water with chlorine dioxide or over-boiling it with heat. So an option is to carry the filter for those times when the water doesn't seem too bad. And should you encounter one of those feces-soaked cow puddles that certain trails offer, use heat or carry chemicals as a backup. It doesn't have to be an either-or situation. I might end up doing both. Putting a pot on the fire or dropping a tab in a bottle doesn't remove particulates, but a filter can. So for the worst of the worst water, run it through your filter first and get it as palatable as possible. And then if you're still concerned about viruses or residual germs, use one of the other 2 methods that can provide extraordinary levels of inactivation if you wait long enough. And check out those videos for details if you're interested in that strategy. So one last idea is the possibility of filtering your water twice. You could carry 2 filters, I suppose, but I'm talking about running the water through a given filter a second time. Now, I did not find any studies on this, but the filter has no idea whether a batch of water is raw or it's been through once already. Reduction rates are just percentages. So if the source water had 100 germs in it and your removal was 90%, you'd have 10 germs left. Well, run that batch back through the same filter, and I'm not aware of any reason why you don't get another 90% reduction, and that brings the germ count down to 1. You could theoretically repeat this process as many times as it takes for you to feel comfortable. So put 6-log filtration on top of 6 logs, so to speak. For good lab practices, though, you should probably separate containers for each stage of the process. For example, one bag labeled dirty for your source water, another marked 1 for your first filtration, and a last bag identified as 2. You could vary the operational tactics of it all, but I just wanted to point out that something like that is an option. Well, I hope that helps, and as always, thank you for watching, and I very much appreciate your time.